In the winter of 1889, Friedrich Nietzsche collapsed in the streets of Turin, Italy. He had just witnessed a horse being flogged in the piazza, and something inside him broke permanently. He threw his arms around the animal's neck, wept, and never fully recovered his mind. In the days that followed, as his sanity unraveled, he wrote a series of increasingly strange letters. He signed some as Caesar, others as Dionysus, and in one, he wrote something that has fascinated philosophers ever since. I have been Buddha in India, Dionysus in Greece. Now consider what this means. Nietzsche had spent decades publicly dismantling Eastern philosophy. He called Buddhism a religion of exhaustion. He labeled it nihilistic, a surrender disguised as wisdom. He believed the Eastern impulse toward selflessness was not enlightenment, but weakness. And yet, in the final flicker of his conscious mind, he did not identify with Socrates or Kant or Voltaire. He identified with the Buddha. This video is about that contradiction. Because when you look closely, really closely, at what Nietzsche believed versus what Buddhism and Hinduism actually teach, something remarkable emerges. The man who fought hardest against Eastern philosophy may have been, without ever realizing it, one of its most devoted students. By the end of this, you will never see Nietzsche or the East the same way again. To understand Nietzsche's complicated relationship with Eastern thought, you first have to understand the man who stood between them, Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer was one of the most unusual philosophers in the Western tradition, a pessimist, a recluse, and, most importantly for our story, a man obsessed with India. He was among the first major European thinkers to take Indian philosophy seriously as a philosophical system rather than mere myth or exotic folklore. He read the Upanishads. He studied Buddhist doctrine. He called his own philosophy, built on the idea that life is fundamentally suffering driven by blind, irrational will, a European relative of Buddhism. He even kept a small gilded statue of the Buddha on his desk alongside a bust of Kant. Nietzsche was deeply shaped by Schopenhauer. He read the world as will and representation at 21 and called it transformative. But here is the problem. Schopenhauer was a brilliant filter, and like all filters, he distorted what passed through him. His understanding of Buddhism was second-hand, westernized, and colored by his own profound pessimism. When Schopenhauer looked at Buddhism, he saw a mirror of his own worldview. Life is suffering, desire is the root of suffering, and the goal is to extinguish the will entirely, to reach a kind of nothingness. Nietzsche inherited this interpretation almost wholesale, and so when he came to attack Buddhism, he was not, in truth, attacking Buddhism at all. He was attacking Schopenhauer's reflection of Buddhism, which is a very different thing. Nietzsche's core attack on Buddhism rested on a single forceful claim, that nirvana, the supposed goal of the Buddhist path, was a longing for nothingness, a desire to be extinguished, to cease. For Nietzsche, this was the ultimate philosophical failure. His entire project was built on the affirmation of life, saying yes to existence, to suffering, to struggle. His ideal human being, the Übermensch, was one who created meaning in a meaningless world, who thrived precisely because of difficulty rather than in spite of it. Buddhism, as he understood it, did the opposite. It saw suffering, recoiled from it, and sought escape, taught passivity, taught resignation. It was, in his language, a religion of the weary. Now here is where Nietzsche stopped reading too early. Buddhism does not begin with escape. It begins with honesty. The first noble truth is the acknowledgement of dukkha, suffering, as an inescapable feature of existence within the cycle of samsara, the endless repetition of birth, life, death, and rebirth. This is not pessimism for its own sake. It is a diagnosis. The second noble truth identifies the cause: craving, attachment, desire. The third noble truth makes a claim that fundamentally separates Buddhism from pure nihilism. It states that suffering has an end. Not because existence ends, but because the relationship to existence can be transformed. And the fourth noble truth is the path itself, the noble eightfold path, the practical, methodical, deeply active discipline of right understanding, right intention, right action, right effort, right mindfulness. This is not passivity. This is one of the most demanding programs of self-transformation ever articulated. Nirvana, then, is not nothingness. It is not the desire for annihilation. It is the cessation of the fires that cause suffering, the extinguishing of craving, delusion, and the clinging to a false sense of permanent self. It is the end of samsara, not the end of being. Buddhism starts, yes, in the same dark place as Schopenhauer. But it does not stay there. It moves through suffering, not away from it, toward a positive, lucid, liberated experience of reality that Schopenhauer, and through him Nietzsche, never fully grasped. Nietzsche saw the first noble truth and closed the book. Had he read to the fourth, his critique might have looked very different. And yet, despite all of this criticism, something else was quietly happening in Nietzsche's notebooks and letters, something that tells a different story entirely. Across his entire body of work, published writings, and private notes, Nietzsche references Eastern philosophy on more than 400 separate occasions. Not to dismiss it casually, but to engage with it, seriously, carefully, and often admiringly. In the Antichrist, the very text where he calls Buddhism a nihilistic religion of exhaustion, he also pauses to praise the Buddha's psychological insight. He agrees explicitly with the Buddha's teaching against ressentiment, against the desire for revenge, against the corrosive bitterness that he himself identified as one of Western morality's most dangerous poisons. He read the Laws of Manu, an ancient Sanskrit legal and philosophical text, with such enthusiasm that he wrote excitedly to his longtime friend and editor Heinrich Koselitz about his discovery. He owned a copy in his private library. He transcribed passages by hand into his notebooks, sometimes noting page numbers. He used a Vedic hymn, drawn from the oldest of all Sanskrit texts, as the motto for his book Daybreak, not as a curiosity, not as decoration, as the philosophical keynote for an entire work. And then there is Paul Deussen. Deussen was one of Nietzsche's closest personal friends and the foremost European scholar of the Vedanta, the philosophical tradition within Hinduism centered on the Upanishads. Deussen was also a friend of Swami Vivekananda, the man who would introduce Indian philosophy to the modern Western world. Through Deussen, Nietzsche had a direct, personal, living connection to the Vedic tradition. In a letter to Deussen, Nietzsche wrote of possessing what he called a trans-European eye, the capacity to step outside European modernity and see it from a position beyond its own assumptions. This is not the language of a man indifferent to the East. This is the language of a man shaped by it. The public Nietzsche attacked. The private Nietzsche studied, annotated, admired, and, in certain key moments, agreed. Now we arrive at the heart of the matter. Because when you lay Nietzsche's philosophy alongside Buddhist and Hindu thought, not Schopenhauer's distorted version, but the actual doctrines, what you find is not a set of opposites. What you find is a set of mirrors. Consider Nietzsche's most demanding philosophical idea, the eternal recurrence. Posits that every moment of your life will recur infinitely. Not as punishment or as cosmic law, but as the ultimate test of affirmation. Could you live your life again, exactly as it was, for eternity? Would you choose it? Samsara, the Buddhist and Hindu concept of the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, is not, on the surface, the same idea. But consider what both are really asking. Both confront the human being with the question of how to face an existence that does not simply end. Both demand that the individual take a stance toward repetition, toward suffering, toward time itself. And both make the quality of that stance, the depth of one's transformation, the central problem of philosophy. Then there is the Übermensch. Nietzsche's Overman is the figure who has overcome the merely human, who has created his own values, transcended inherited morality, and become what Nietzsche calls a self-surpassing being. The Übermensch is not a destination but a direction, an ongoing process of becoming. Now consider the Vedantic concept at the heart of the Upanishads. The instruction to know that you are the Atman, the universal self, the ground of being that underlies all individual existence. The Veda, like Nietzsche, insists that the ordinary man, the small, ego-bound, socially conditioned self, is something to be transcended. Liberation is not the preservation of the individual self. It is the recognition that the individual self was always something more. And then the self itself. Nietzsche argued that what we call the subject, the stable, unified I at the center of experience, is a fiction, a grammatical convenience, A story we tell ourselves because the mind cannot tolerate the chaos of what is actually happening beneath the surface of thought. The Buddha said the same thing 2.5 millennia earlier. The doctrine of anatta, non-self, holds that there is no permanent, unchanging self within living beings. What we call the self is nothing more than a temporary combination of physical and mental states. There is no captain. There is only the ship and the sea. Both arrived at the same unsettling, liberating truth. The self that you are so desperately trying to protect and fulfill does not exist in the way you think it does. And then there is the most haunting convergence of all. Nietzsche's Dionysus, the god of ecstasy, of destruction, of transformation, of dance, is one of the central figures in his philosophy. Dionysus represents the chaos that precedes creation, the dissolution that makes renewal possible. Schopenhauer himself drew a direct connection between Dionysus and Shiva, the Hindu deity of destruction and transformation. And the readers of Thus Spoke Zarathustra have long noticed that Nietzsche's many references to dance seem to invoke, almost irresistibly, the image of the dancing Shiva, Natraja, the cosmic dancer whose movement is the rhythm of creation and destruction. Shiva is the wandering ascetic whose home is the Himalayas. Shiva is the lord of yoga and the wild dancer simultaneously. Shiva destroys so that the world may be reborn. Nietzsche's Dionysus does the same. Two thinkers, separated by centuries and continents, arrived at the same terrifying, liberating truth, that creation and destruction are not opposites. They are the same motion. It would be easy to treat all of this as a pleasant intellectual exercise, a curiosity for philosophy students, a footnote in the history of ideas. But I think it is considerably more than that. Consider what it means that two of the most penetrating philosophical traditions in human history, one emerging from the mountains of ancient India, one from the libraries and mental agonies of 19th century Europe, arrived independently at so many of the same conclusions. They both saw that suffering is not an aberration but a feature of human existence. They both understood that the self we take ourselves to be is, in some fundamental sense, a construct. They both insisted that ordinary existence, unreflective, desire-driven, comfort-seeking, falls short of what a human being is capable of. And they both believed that transformation, genuine, demanding, total transformation, was possible. This convergence is not a coincidence. It is a signal. It points toward something universal, not culturally specific, not historically contingent, but structurally true about the human condition. And here is why that matters to you watching this now. Both Nietzsche and the Buddha were ultimately asking the same question that you are asking, whether you know it or not. Not a philosophical abstraction, but an urgent, personal question. How do I live well in a world that offers no guarantees? Nietzsche said, create your values. Overcome yourself. Affirm the chaos. The Buddha said, examine yourself. Release the craving. Awaken. Different maps, drawn in different languages, pointing toward the same terrain. The fact that one of the West's most individualistic, combative, life-affirming philosophers and one of history's most celebrated traditions of inner transformation were circling the same truth. This should give us pause. It should make us hold our certainties a little more loosely. Nietzsche never went to India. He planned to, in a sense, not literally but philosophically. At the end of his book Daybreak, he describes setting sail for an imagined horizon. A new India, undiscovered, waiting at the edge of the known world. And he says, in his characteristically strange and solitary way, that it is an India where no one lives but Nietzsche himself. This is deeply revealing. He knew the East was out there. He read it, quoted it, argued with it, borrowed from it, was shaped by it, and then somehow failed to recognize it when he looked in the mirror. He spent his life orbiting something he could not quite name. He had the trans-European eye, but perhaps he looked through it without fully seeing what was on the other side. He misread Buddhism as nihilism, when it was something far more demanding, a call to transformation that his own philosophy echoed. He dismissed the Eastern idea of non-self, not realizing that his own account of the fictional subject said almost exactly the same thing. He championed the Übermensch as a purely Western, purely Nietzschean invention, without acknowledging that the Upanishads had already asked the same human being to transcend the merely human. At the onset of his collapse, in those final letters written in the ruins of his mind, something surfaced that his philosophy had tried to contain. He called himself Buddha. He did not call himself Schopenhauer. He did not call himself Voltaire. He reached, in his extremity, for the figure he had most publicly opposed and claimed him as himself. Perhaps that is the most honest thing Nietzsche ever wrote. And I want to leave you with something he said in 1876, years before the collapse, years before the Übermensch, at a moment when something in him was still open. He wrote, "We must trust in our own experience alone, though it may seem slight and meager, and if we are honest with ourselves, we shall find something far richer and more instructive than we had expected." Sit with that, because whatever he meant, and Nietzsche always meant more than he said, it suggests that somewhere beneath the hammer and the thunder, there was a man listening very carefully to a voice that was not entirely his own.